When did history begin? It's hard to say, really. You could point to a plethora of moments in time and make multiple arguments for or against them. Did it start over 51,000 years ago with the first cave paintings? Or maybe we should be looking at structures like the pyramids or Stonehenge to help guide us. Though it is difficult to pinpoint exactly when history began, thinking about history as a field of pursuit with the intention of disseminating knowledge that ripples throughout generations as a Western tradition, that's something we have a better time frame on. The origins of this kind of history in the West begin in ancient Greece. Two men, Herodotus and Thucydides, both born in the 5th century BCE, would write two tomes of vastly different character that would serve as a contrast in how to approach and think about history. Herodotus came first. He was a couple decades older, so he had a head start. His work was called The Histories, and it covered the Greco-Persian Wars, the repeated attempts of the Persians to invade and subjugate the Greeks. Because he came first, Herodotus gained the title, the Father of History, a moniker that he's still frequently known by today. The issue with Herodotus, though, is that while he got some things right, he was blending a lot of fact with fiction. Mythology, legend, half-truths, and falsehoods all made their way into his work. He did get the general gist of the battle at Marathon in 490 BCE, but he would also claim that Persians stole bags of gold from giant ants in India and that headless men lived in North Africa. He said, in reference to Africa, quote, "There live the headless ones who have their eyes in their chests," end quote. Now, Thucydides didn't take too kindly to this approach to history. In his work, The History of the Peloponnesian War, he explored the conflict between Athens and Sparta, and he made it clear that he was committed to the facts. In the first chapter, he says, quote, "So little pains do the vulgar take in the investigation of truth, accepting readily the first story that comes to hand," end quote. He goes further by saying, quote, "And with reference to the narrative of events, I have not made it into a matter of entertainment, nor have I written down the first story that comes my way. I have recorded only what I saw myself, or learned from others whom I made every effort to check for accuracy," end quote. In contrast to Herodotus, he's trying to make an effort to focus on reality without invoking divine will or myths. He's focusing on the real world, on human actions and military strategy. I think you're starting to see why highlighting these different approaches is important. Today, we're bombarded with people weaving fact with fiction, retelling history in a way that suits their interests, and geopolitical actors trying to twist all of this in a way that benefits them. As we go through this episode, and all future episodes together, and even when we're not together, and you're seeing someone make extraordinary claims, I want you to remember Herodotus and Thucydides. I want you to think of these two men whenever you're consuming media. I want them to be in the back of your mind, or maybe on each of your shoulders, whispering in your ear. That tension is very real today. It's a push and pull between fact and fiction, between the allures of myth and legend and facts on the ground. It's, as we discussed in episode 0, a war for hearts and minds. This episode and the next few episodes are going to critique and deconstruct a miniseries produced by Darryl Cooper on the Martyr Made podcast. The series is titled Fear and Loathing in the New Jerusalem and was released in 2015 and 2016 with a focus on covering the history and origins of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. For some strange reason, it seems that it has just recently gone mainstream, with Cooper in recent months appearing on well-known shows like Joe Rogan and in an interview with Tucker Carlson. For those unfamiliar with Cooper, over the past several months, he has very quickly become the darling of the woke right, and increasingly, as the two converge, the woke left. The reason for this appeal stems from the fact that on his podcast and in public statements, Cooper has made incredibly controversial comments. These include claims like Churchill was one of the main villains of World War II, and that Hitler masked his anti-Semitism in the lead-up to becoming Chancellor in 1933. As of the date of recording, I've listened to Part 1 of Fear and Loathing in the New Jerusalem, and this episode will only be focused on that same part. It's a 6-part series, and the first number of episodes of Crackpot History will correspond to a critique of each episode of Fear and Loathing in the New Jerusalem. Cooper tells us up front that he's not going to preach to us or try to convince us that one side is right or one side is wrong. By the end of this first installment, I believe you'll have a very good sense to make an assessment of that for yourself. Let's begin. Picking a point in time as the definitive start date of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is hard to pin down. You could go with 1947, when the United Nations passed a partition plan to divide up the region into a Palestinian and a Jewish state. 1917 would be equally valid, the year the British took the region from the Ottomans. You could even go with 70 CE, when the Romans took Jerusalem and destroyed the Second Jewish Temple. The time period that Cooper opens with is the late 19th century in Eastern Europe. It's within this crucible in which modern Zionism is born. He explains how the Jews of Europe endured persecution for centuries. I'd like to dive a bit deeper here to set the stage. Context is everything, after all. Jews were indeed persecuted for centuries across Europe. They were expelled from England in 1290 by Edward I and wouldn't be permitted to return until 1656. The same happened in Spain in 1492. 1,000-year-old communities were destroyed, and their possessions were seized to finance royal coffers. Many of the expelled Jews would flee eastward and take refuge in Poland, which would eventually become the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. As early as the 1200s, Polish kings passed laws granting Jews protection, freedom of religion, and legal autonomy. These decrees were reinforced by subsequent kings throughout the 1500s. The Jews had it pretty good in Poland throughout the 16th century, all things considered, given their historical treatment in Europe. Jewish life flourished, an exception in Europe rather than the norm. That would change dramatically in the late 1700s, however. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was carved up amongst the powers of the day, and Imperial Russia found itself absorbing around 1 million Jews. In response to this major population transfer, Catherine the Great, Empress of Russia, decided to sequester the Jews in a territory known as the Pale of Settlement. The Pale was a geographic area where Jews were allowed to live and build their lives. It consisted of territory that includes modern-day Poland, Ukraine, Belarus, Moldova, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. The Jews weren't permitted to leave. Catherine didn't want Jews mixing with the Russian population, and Russian merchants didn't want Jews competing with them for local trade and services. This was a win-win solution for the Kremlin. The crown was able to keep their Jews confined while simultaneously keeping their merchants satisfied. Not only were they geographically restricted, but the Jews were also treated as second-class citizens. They couldn't own rural land, faced education quotas, endured a separate and unequal tax system imposed by the state, and they were barred from many guilds and professions. The oppression reached a new ceiling in 1827, during the Cantonist conscription, when Jewish boys throughout the Pale, some under 10 years old, were taken from their families to serve in the military for up to 25 years, in the hope that they would be Russified and lose touch with their Jewish roots. It's within this backdrop of persecution and sequestration that things start to reach a crescendo in the later 1800s. In 1881, Tsar Alexander II of Russia was assassinated. While none of the direct assassins were Jewish, one conspirator associated with the group was, and that alone was enough to spark public outrage. Over the next 3 years, more than 200 pogroms erupted across the Pale of Settlement, targeting communities with devastating violence. If this is the first time you're hearing that word, pogrom, Cooper does a decent job at describing it in the opening scenes of the first installment of this miniseries. He describes how a community of Jews is descended upon by a mob that invades their homes, beats them mercilessly, and kills families in front of one another. When the protagonist in this visualization comes upon a police officer looking for help, he's bludgeoned and subsequently killed. It was state-sanctioned violence. Tensions escalated dramatically in 1903 when the Jews of Kishinev, modern-day Chisinau, Moldova, were falsely blamed for the murder of a 14-year-old boy. Anti-Semitic newspapers claimed that Jews had killed him and used his blood for the Jewish holiday of Passover. The result was a storm on the Jewish community of the city. 49 were killed, hundreds injured, and thousands of homes and businesses were destroyed. The pogrom pierced the domestic veil and drew international condemnation. Just weeks later, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, a fabricated anti-Semitic document sponsored by elements within the Russian state, was published by the same newspaper editor who had helped incite the Kishinev pogrom. The protocols were widely printed and circulated with official support, providing a convenient scapegoat in the Jews to deflect public anger away from the crown. While persecution was intensifying in the East, a parallel crisis was unfolding in the West. In France, a saga began in 1894 when Captain Alfred Dreyfus, a Jewish officer on the French general staff, was falsely accused of passing military secrets to the Germans. He was convicted of treason and publicly humiliated. His saber snapped in front of a crowd. When evidence emerged proving his innocence, it was deliberately suppressed. After years of legal battles and imprisonment, Dreyfus was finally exonerated in 1906. The case rocked France and triggered a wave of anti-Semitism, revealing that Jews were seen as outsiders not only in the ghettos of Eastern Europe, but in the so-called enlightened and cosmopolitan West as well. Amid the rising tide of chaos, persecution and betrayal, many Jews began searching for a way out. The Dreyfus affair, like the pogroms in Russia, made it painfully clear no degree of assimilation or patriotism could erase their perceived otherness. Whether in the Russian Empire or the French Republic, the message was clear: they didn't belong. This wasn't a political awakening by choice. It was an existential reckoning forced upon them by circumstances beyond their control. It's no surprise, then, that in the face of this growing hostility, various Jewish movements and ideologies began to emerge across Europe in search of a way out. One of the groups Cooper mentions is Bilu, a pioneering movement of young Jews who sought to escape persecution by immigrating to Zion, meaning the land of Israel, and rebuilding Jewish life there. Cooper reads from Bilu's founding document, its manifesto, written in 1882, which declares, quote, "We want one, a home in our country. It was given to us by the mercy of God. It is ours as registered in the archives of history. 2. To beg it of the Sultan himself, and if it be impossible to obtain this, to beg that we may at least possess it as a state within a larger state. The internal administration to be ours, to have our civil and political rights, and to act with the Turkish Empire only in foreign affairs, so as to help our brother Ishmael in his time of need. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one, and our land Zion is our only hope." End quote. Notably, the religious framing appeals to divine right, and references to Zion are omitted in Cooper's reading of the charter. These weren't minor points. They reflected a deeply religious motivation shared by many early Zionists. Cooper's takeaway from reading this manifesto from Bilu, a group that at its peak had under 1,000 members in Europe, is twofold. First, that the appeal to the Ottomans and the invocation of Ishmael, the biblical father of Arabs, indicate that the conflict here wasn't between Jews and Arabs, but rather between Jews and Europe. To support this, he quotes Larry Collins in his book O Jerusalem, quote, "With few exceptions, the Jewish people had dwelt in relative security among the Arabs over the centuries. The golden age of the diaspora had welcomed the Jews when the doors of much of Europe were closed to them. The ghastly chain of crimes perpetrated on the Jewish people, culminating in the crematoriums of Germany, had been inflicted on them by the Christian nations of Europe, not those of the Islamic East." End quote. Cooper's second point is that the conflict we see today is not religious or ethnic, but political in origin. As he puts it, quote, "This was and always was a political conflict with definite causes and specific grievances." End quote. But both of these arguments lack important historical context. Bilu was a European Jewish movement, founded in response to European anti-Semitism, so naturally, its documents focused on European threats. But that doesn't mean Jews in Arab lands were living in peace and security at the time. In fact, several disturbing examples stand out and are worth mentioning. In 1840, a blood libel in Syria led to the torture and death of Jews falsely accused of ritually murdering a Christian monk. In 1834, a month-long pogrom in Safed involved mass rape, looting, and murder. In Yemen, Jews were subjected to the Orphan Decree, requiring the forced conversion of Jewish orphans to Islam. This wasn't just a 19th century phenomenon. We also have testimony from earlier centuries like the Epistle to Yemen written in 1172 by Maimonides, a Jewish philosopher and scholar. In the letter addressed to the Jewish community of Yemen, who were facing religious persecution and pressure to convert to Islam, he writes, quote, "God has hurled us in the midst of this people, the Arabs, who have persecuted us severely, and passed baneful and discriminatory legislation against us, as Scripture has forewarned us." End quote. In summary, yes, Jews in Europe, particularly in the 19th century, faced widespread persecution and existential threats, as we've already seen. That reality drove many, including the Bilu movement, to seek safety and self-determination elsewhere. But using Bilu alone as a lens to explain Jewish-Arab relations without acknowledging what was happening in Jewish communities throughout the Middle East, both historically and contemporaneously, is a glaring omission. Like in Poland, there were moments and places in the Islamic world where Jewish communities flourished, but those moments were often fragile, dependent on the tolerance of specific rulers, and could vanish overnight. To suggest that harmonious coexistence defined Jewish life in the Middle East based on a single reference to Ishmael in a proto-Zionist manifesto is incredibly selective. Cooper's second claim that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is purely political and not at all religious is hard to take seriously when you consider that he omits the closing line of the Bilu Manifesto from his reference to the document. "Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one, and our land, Zion, is our only hope." Does the Temple Mount, where the ancient Jewish temple stood, hold no significance to Jews? Does the Al-Haram al-Sharif not matter to Muslims? These aren't footnotes, they're deep roots, and trying to silo the political from the religious is like cutting a tree off at the base and expecting it to keep standing. It just doesn't work. Theodor Herzl was born in Budapest in 1860 and later settled in Vienna. Geographically, he found himself between two major centers of Jewish crises, France and Russia. While in Paris during the Dreyfus trial, Herzl, an assimilated Jew, was deeply shaken by the intensity of anti-Semitism it exposed. He began to question whether Jews had any real future in Europe. In 1896, Herzl published a pamphlet titled The Jewish State. It would become the ideological bedrock of political Zionism, the movement advocating for a sovereign modern Jewish state to secure the future of the Jewish people. Cooper quotes extensively from The Jewish State to lay out the foundations for Herzl's thought, and to his credit, he selects some pivotal passages, but it's worth examining how those quotes are presented and, more importantly, what's left out. One of the passages Cooper reads is, quote, "We have honestly endeavored, everywhere, to merge ourselves in the social life of surrounding communities and to preserve the faith of our fathers. We are not permitted to do so. In vain are we loyal patriots, our loyalty in some places running to extremes. In vain do we make the same sacrifices of life and property as our fellow citizens. In vain do we strive to increase the fame of our native land, in science and art, or her wealth by trade and commerce. In countries where we have lived for centuries, we are still cried down as strangers." End quote. What's not included is the very next line in the same paragraph when referring to countries where Jews are cried down as strangers, quote, "and often by those whose ancestors were not yet domiciled in the land, where Jews had already had experience of suffering." End quote. This omission may seem small, but it's part of a broader pattern. Cooper presents this as a continuous quote, using quote and end quote, yet here skips over a mid-paragraph sentence without noting the cut, and this won't be the last time something like this happens. He continues quoting Herzl from the same paragraph after the omission of that last sentence fragment, quote, "The majority may decide which are the strangers, for this, as indeed every point which arises in the relations between nations, is a question of might. I do not here surrender any portion of our prescriptive right when I make this statement merely in my own name as an individual. In the world, as it now is, and for an indefinite period will probably remain, might precedes right. It is useless, therefore, for us to be loyal patriots, as were the Huguenots who were forced to emigrate, if we could only be left in peace. But I think we shall not be left in peace." End quote. Without signaling a break in quotation, Cooper skips over the next full paragraph, which states, quote, "Oppression and persecution cannot exterminate us. No nation on earth has survived such struggles and sufferings as we have gone through. Jew-baiting has merely stripped off our weaklings. The strong among us were invariably true to their race when persecution broke out against them." This attitude was most clearly apparent in the period immediately following the emancipation of the Jews. Those Jews who were advanced intellectually and materially entirely lost the feeling of belonging to their race. Wherever our political well-being has lasted for any length of time, we have assimilated with our surroundings. I think this is not discreditable. Hence, the statesman who would wish to see a Jewish strain in his nation would have to provide for the duration of our political well-being, and even a Bismarck could not do that." End quote. In his narration, Cooper skips ahead to the following, quote, "For old prejudices against us still lie deep in the hearts of the people. He who would have proofs of this need only listen to the people when they speak with frankness and simplicity. Proverb and fairy tale are both anti-Semitic. A nation is everywhere a great child, which can certainly be educated, but its education would, even in most favorable circumstances, occupy such a vast amount of time that we could, as already mentioned, remove our own difficulties by other means long before the process was accomplished." End quote. These quotes are powerful and express Herzl's deep pessimism about assimilation in Europe. But again, sections in between these passages, including entire connecting paragraphs, are omitted, without explanation, when Cooper states to the audience he is quoting in full. This isn't a gotcha moment. It's about highlighting the difference between responsible and sloppy quoting. If you're quoting a historical document, you can quote the full text, start and stop deliberately but clearly, skip for brevity but say you're doing so, or summarize or paraphrase rather than presenting something as a direct quote. Cooper does none of these. He presents the quotes as full and uninterrupted. But they're not. And that matters, especially when we're dealing with one of the foundational texts of modern Zionism. Editorial discretion aside, Herzl's core message comes through clearly. Jews in Europe were in a precarious position, and the dream of assimilation had failed. Zionism, specifically political Zionism, emerged as a response to that crisis. For many, it wasn't just a vision, but a lifeline. Cooper argues that Herzl and many early modern Zionist leaders gave little thought to the population already living in the land they envisioned as a future Jewish state. He frames this as part of a broader European mindset at the time, a universal tendency to overlook local populations in frontier regions. This is a mostly fair observation. Many early Zionist writings do indeed gloss over the presence of the local Arab population. The overarching theme was a sense that land could be, and indeed was, purchased from landowners for the purpose of Jewish settlement. However, later on, we do see significant efforts by Zionist leadership to reach some kind of accommodation, most notably through partition plans and negotiations with Arab leaders, but we'll come back to that. This brings us to the complicated and often subjective question of indigeneity. There's no question that Arabs had been living in the Holy Land for centuries and are indigenous to the region. At the same time, Jews were forcibly exiled from the same territory by the Romans centuries before the rise of Islam. So the question becomes, does historical exile invalidate a people's claim to their ancestral homeland? And if it does that change when persecution elsewhere makes exile existential? Regardless of where one stands on that question, Cooper makes a couple of unforced errors when discussing Jewish and Arab claims to the land and the evolution of national identity. The first is the claim that all early Zionists were European. That's simply not accurate. Long before Herzl's political Zionism took form, proto-Zionist activity was already underway, including from Jews in the Middle East and North Africa. One example is David ben Shimon, a Moroccan rabbi who moved to Jerusalem in the mid-19th century and brought dozens of Jewish families with him. For ben Shimon and his followers, moving to the land of Israel was a religious obligation, not a political project. Another example is Rabbi Yaakov Meyer, a Sephardic leader who either attended or supported the First Zionist Congress in Switzerland in 1897. These were active participants in Zionism and Proto-Zionism who were not European. To claim the movement was exclusively European ignores this historical diversity. The second misstep is Cooper's critique of early Zionists for viewing the Arab world as monolithic. He argues that they saw Palestinians as indistinct from other Arabs in the region, interchangeable people within a vast, undivided Ottoman Empire. He even draws a European analogy. Imagine if Europe were unified like the Ottoman Empire, he says. Outsiders might assume Belgians and Frenchmen were the same, even though locals would never see it that way. Cooper explains this in the following terms, quote, "But of course the locals didn't see it that way. I'm not just an Arab, I'm a Palestinian. A Palestinian is not an Egyptian. That's like telling a Frenchman to go live in England. You're all a Euro something or other. What's the difference?" End quote. Here's the problem with that analogy. At the time Cooper is describing, the people we now call Palestinians were, in fact, still figuring out what to call themselves and determining what their national identity was. Take the first Palestine Arab Congress, held in Jerusalem in 1919. One of its resolutions declared, quote, "We consider Palestine nothing but part of Arab Syria, and it has never been separated from it at any stage. We are tied to it by national, religious, linguistic, moral, economic, and geographic bounds." End quote. Nothing but part of Arab Syria. That's notable language, and it suggests that articulating a distinct Palestinian national identity at that point in time would have been premature or at least contested. Now, to be fair, this would change very quickly. By the Fourth Palestine Arab Congress in 1920, we do see calls for an independent Palestinian state, a clear sign that distinct Palestinian nationalism was beginning to form. But if we're judging the mindset of early modern Zionists around the turn of the century, it's misleading to criticize them for blurring identities that even Palestinian leaders at the time were not yet distinguishing. Even historian Benny Morris, whom Cooper cites elsewhere, notes that Palestinian nationalism began to coalesce in direct response to growing Jewish immigration, and that prior to World War I, the term Palestine had no political or administrative meaning under the Ottomans. Cooper himself even admits in this episode that local Arabs were not particularly political prior to World War I, so by his own standard, the emergence of a clear, distinct Palestinian identity didn't fully materialize until the early 1920s. In conclusion, multiple things can be true. Early Zionists deserve critique for failing to fully account for the Arab population already living in the region, but to characterize Zionism as an entirely European project, or to fault early Zionists for not understanding distinctions between regional Arab identities that had not yet clearly formed, misses the mark. The Rothschild family was one of the wealthiest and most influential Jewish dynasties, having built its fortune primarily through banking. In the 19th century, the family had established a prominent presence across Western Europe, becoming key figures within the aristocracy. One of the most notable figures in the Rothschild family was Baron Lionel Walter Rothschild, a British banker, politician, and philanthropist. Lionel was deeply involved in the Zionist movement and played a crucial role in garnering British support for the establishment of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. As a prominent member of the British aristocracy, he had the political connections and financial resources to push for Zionist aspirations within the British government. His efforts directly contributed to the issuance of the Balfour Declaration. In fact, it was Rothschild to whom the declaration was specifically addressed. The document, issued on November 2, 1917 by Lord Arthur Balfour, the British Foreign Minister, expressed the British government's support for the creation of a Jewish national home in Palestine. It states, quote, "Dear Lord Rothschild, I have much pleasure in conveying to you, on behalf of His Majesty's government, the following declaration of sympathy with Jewish Zionist aspirations, which has been submitted to and approved by the Cabinet. His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. I should be grateful if you would bring this declaration to the knowledge of the Zionist Federation." End quote. It's clear that the Rothschilds, through both their financial influence and political connections, were key figures in the early Zionist movement. However, Cooper complicates the discussion when he says, quote, "Just go Google the name along with conspiracy or Illuminati, and you'll quickly find yourself lost in the darkest corners of the internet. In fact, don't do that." End quote. What are we doing here? Are we doing history or not? By even hinting at a connection between the Rothschild family and popular conspiracy theories surrounding the Illuminati, and then hedging that with, actually, don't look that up, Cooper is only stoking the fires of suspicion he seems to caution against. A lane needs to be picked, and Cooper is blurring the lines with comments like this. If the goal is to engage with history responsibly, this isn't that. Cooper goes on to explore how mythology played a role in inspiring early modern Zionists to encourage immigration to Palestine. He uses flowery biblical language to describe the return to the land by God's command, even invoking the idea of killing the inhabitants present there. He qualifies this by stating that no modern scholar would claim the events described in these stories literally happened. However, he then goes on to say, quote, "But this is the kind of thing you need if you're really going to fire up a revolutionary. All revolutionaries live on mythology. Reason can justify and rationalize, but emotion motivates. No revolution's ever been sparked, or at least sustained, through reasoned argument. Mythology is like oxygen to a revolutionary. Whether you're talking about Marx's dialectic of history, or God's chosen people, or the return to the promised land, these ideas have power to drive people like no other force." End quote. Cooper is clearly positioning Zionism alongside other radical ideologies of the early 20th century. This comparison seems designed to make the audience view Zionism similarly to Marxism or communism, ideologies historically associated with totalitarian regimes and human suffering. The reasoning for this comparison is clear. He buttresses this argument by referencing Jews in high-level positions during the Bolshevik overthrow of Imperial Russia, such as Trotsky. The implication is that Jews, radicalized by previous persecution, were seeking radical movements as an outlet for this frustration. But this oversimplifies the situation. The Russian Revolution of 1917 was fundamentally about overthrowing the existing state structure. In contrast, the Zionist movement sought to work with the existing powers to establish a national home for the Jewish people, which is a very different goal than the Bolshevik approach of rapid revolution and state dismantling. The Zionists asked the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire for permission. Lenin didn't grab a coffee with the Tsar to hash things out. The comparison is also problematic in terms of scope. Marxism aimed to abolish class structures and revolutionize societies worldwide. Zionism, in contrast, was focused on establishing a national homeland for Jews in a specific region, the Land of Israel, a place to which Jews have an ancestral and historic connection. This was never a call for global revolution or radical reordering of the world. This isn't workers of the world unite kind of thinking. As for historical and ancestral connections to the territory, Cooper briefly tries to undermine this too. He says, quote, "The Zionists would have to draw on the same spirit that drove their ancient forebears because, like them, they were seeking to carve out a new nation in a land already occupied by other people. They would have to be guided by the same God that told their conquering ancestors, 'I gave you a land on which you did not toil, in cities you did not build, and you live in them and eat from vineyards and olive groves that you did not plant.'" End quote. Here, Cooper is quoting the book of Joshua and implying that just as the Jews were invaders in biblical times, so too were they invading the land in the 20th century. This narrative attempts to strip away the Jewish connection and indigeneity to the Holy Land, but there's a problem here. The biblical account of conquest contradicts both the archaeological and genetic records. Archaeological excavations from this time frame don't show widespread destruction as the Old Testament suggests. We see clear examples of destruction in other biblical events, such as in the destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonians in 586 BCE, or the destruction of Samaria in 722 BCE. But there's no similar evidence of widespread destruction linked to the Israelites and the Canaanites during the Iron Age. Archaeological digs like Tel Dan in the north and Tel Beersheba in the south of Israel reveal evidence of Israelite society developing. Pottery found at these sites resembles that of the Canaanites, and there are indications of public works like water systems and storehouses, showing the gradual evolution of Israelite society from within the Canaanite population. As archaeologist William Dever claims, most of those who became Israelites were originally Canaanites. This is further supported by the genetic record. A 2017 genetic study sequenced genomes from 3,700-year-old individuals from Sidon, a Canaanite city-state. The study found that despite cultural differences, the people of the Levant originated from the Canaanites, further challenging the biblical narrative of a foreign invasion. The researchers said, quote, "People from the highly differentiated urban culture on the Levant coast and inland people with different modes of subsistence were nevertheless genetically similar," supporting previous reports that the different cultural groups who inhabited the Levant during the Bronze Age, such as the Ammonites, Moabites, Israelites, and Phoenicians, each achieved their own cultural identities, but all shared a common genetic and ethnic root with the Canaanites. End quote. So why might the book of Joshua, Cooper quotes, conflict with the historical record? Cooper himself alluded to the power of myth earlier. Civilizational destruction implies that the divine was on your side. It lends legitimacy to your cause. It's far more compelling during the times of the Bible to say that your society arose from the conquest of another than to say it was a gradual cultural evolution. That was a major deep dive into the very distant past. Let's get back to the 20th century. One of the other criticisms Cooper levies against the early modern Zionists is that Zionism attempted and succeeded in uniting disparate groups of Jews who, up until that point, had little in common. He says, quote, "But to me, the most important and impressive and fascinating thing that they were able to pull off was this creation and emergence of Jewish identity, pulling together a nation of people with a sense of common identity and purpose out of a scattered people who had become culturally and linguistically foreign to one another. It's an incredible achievement." End quote. This is a curious contradiction. Cooper repeatedly acknowledges the existential threats Jews faced in Europe, the pogroms in the East, and the collapse of the assimilation project in the West following the Dreyfus Affair. When people are under collective threat, they circle the wagons. Whether separated by borders or languages, Jewish communities had long maintained ties through shared religious texts, rituals, and memory. Zionism didn't invent Jewish solidarity, it channeled it. The first Zionist Congress in 1897 had representatives from 17 countries, including Russia, Austria-Hungary, Germany, France, Switzerland, Britain, Romania, Bulgaria, Italy, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Serbia. This covers the vast majority of the European continent. However, Cooper rightly points out that not all Jews were Zionists. There were prominent critics like Lucian Wolff in Britain and the Jewish Labor Bund in Eastern Europe, which opposed Zionism in favor of cultural autonomy in the diaspora. Still, the speed and breadth with which modern Zionism gained traction speaks to the pre-existing connective tissue across Jewish communities, despite their geographic separation. These Jews may have lived in different lands and spoken different languages, but they celebrated the same holidays, read from the same holy texts, faced the same direction in prayer, and drew on a common origin story. To suggest that Zionism forged these bonds out of nothing is to ignore the centuries of religious, cultural, and historical continuity. There's a more modern example that reflects this reality. In the 1980s and 1990s, Israel carried out a series of covert airlifts that brought tens of thousands of Ethiopian Jews to safety. In 1991, during Operation Solomon, over 14,000 Ethiopian Jews were evacuated in just 36 hours as a civil war threatened to engulf the country. Despite their distinct language, food, dress, and traditions, these Jews were welcomed to Israel as kin. Their arrival added a new dimension to Israeli society, but they weren't perceived as a foreign element. It was a return. This illustrates what was already evident at the dawn of the 20th century. Jewish identity, though diverse in expression, was united by a shared religious and historical foundation. Zionism did not conjure this out of thin air. It built upon it. It's unlikely that when the Ottomans launched a surprise naval attack on Russian assets in the Black Sea on October 29, 1914, they understood the full consequences of their actions. That move would ultimately lead to the unraveling of an empire that had lasted more than 6 centuries. In response to the attack, Britain and France declared war on the Ottoman Empire on November 5, 1914. A few months later, in March 1915, the Allies attempted a naval assault within the Dardanelles Strait with the goal of capturing Constantinople. That operation failed disastrously. In April, following the collapse of the naval campaign, the Allies initiated amphibious landings on the Gallipoli Peninsula in an attempt to knock the Ottomans out of the war. These two ended in catastrophe. Amidst these developments, in early 1914, the second son of Sharif Hussein, the Hashemite leader of Mecca, approached British officials in Cairo requesting arms to use against the Ottomans. The British declined. In July 1915, Hussein sent a letter to Henry McMahon, the British High Commissioner of Egypt, and stated that he would rally an army of Arabs and revolt against Ottoman rule in the Arabian Peninsula. With the Gallipoli landings faltering and the Ottoman front proving difficult to break, the British saw strategic value in opening a new internal front via an Arab uprising. The price? Hussein demanded recognition of an independent Arab state. McMahon replied months later, on October 24th, 1915. The Arab Revolt officially began on June 10, 1916. The McMahon-Hussein correspondence remains a source of historical controversy, particularly regarding whether the promised Arab territory included Palestine. The language used in McMahon's letters was deliberately vague, in part because at the same time, Britain was engaged in secret negotiations with France to divide Ottoman territory into spheres of influence. A plan that would be formalized in the Sykes-Picot Agreement in May 1916. These overlapping negotiations with both the Arabs and the French revealed the inconsistencies and conflicts within British wartime diplomacy. In his October 24th letter, McMahon promised Hussein most of the lands he requested, with 2 notable exceptions. Quote, portions of Syria lying to the west of the districts of Damascus, Homs, Hama, and Aleppo, on the grounds that they were not purely Arab, end quote. The second limitation was that Britain's commitments to Hussein could not conflict with its arrangements with France. McMahon would later assert that it was clearly understood that Palestine was not part of the area promised to Hussein. In a letter dated July 23, 1937, McMahon wrote, quote, I feel it my duty to state, and I do so definitely and emphatically, that it was not intended by me in giving this pledge to King Hussein to include Palestine in the area in which Arab independence was promised. I also had every reason to believe at the time that the fact that Palestine was not included in my pledge was well understood by King Hussein. End quote. McMahon's interpretation is supported by 3 key events from the same period. First, in March 1916, then Foreign Secretary Edward Grey proposed to the French and Russians that the Allies make, quote, an arrangement in regard to Palestine completely satisfactory to Jewish aspirations, end quote. This suggests that the British didn't consider Palestine part of the territory promised to Hussein. Second, in April 1918, Gilbert Clayton, Britain's Director of Military Intelligence in the Middle East, wrote to Mark Sykes that Arab leadership under Hussein understood that the British considered territory east of the Jordan River to be within the Hashemite sphere of influence. By implication, this left the status of Palestine west of the Jordan outside of the Sharif's purview. And lastly, in April 1917, before Mark Sykes left for Egypt to head a British political mission, Prime Minister Lloyd George instructed him not to make any political promises to the Arabs, quote, particularly none in regard to Palestine, end quote. He added that the Arabs, quote, probably realized that there was no prospect of their being allowed any control over Palestine, end quote. This historical context matters because the McMahon-Hussein correspondence is frequently cited to undermine the legitimacy of the 1917 Balfour Declaration. Critics often portray the Balfour Declaration as a betrayal of British commitments to the Arabs, but according to those directly involved in the 1915 negotiations, Palestine was never explicitly promised to Hussein, and this distinction is crucial when assessing competing claims. This isn't to say that there was no subterfuge occurring. It's clear that the Sykes-Picot Agreement with the French conflicted with the McMahon-Hussein correspondence, but given what we've just covered together, to say that it also conflicted with the Balfour Declaration is quite a reach. One of the more colorful claims that Cooper makes is that prominent Zionists, especially those regularly engaging high-level politicians in Britain and elsewhere, leaned into the myth of a grand global Zionist conspiracy as a strategic tool. According to Cooper, many non-Jews in that era harbored outsized beliefs about global Jewish influence, beliefs that by modern standards would be considered anti-Semitic, and that Zionists deliberately exploited these perceptions to win political support for a Jewish homeland in Palestine. To support this claim, Cooper cites a series of quotes from British officials, but his framing often strips away crucial contexts. A telling example is his use of a statement by Mark Sykes, the British diplomat involved in the 1916 Sykes-Picot Agreement, who in March 1918 addressed Faisal, a son of Hussein, the Sharif of Mecca. Cooper quotes Sykes as saying, quote, "Believe me when I say this race, despised and weak, is universal, all-powerful, and cannot be put down," end quote. So, yes, Sykes is clearly trafficking in tropes that echo the protocols of the Elders of Zion-style tinfoil, but he's doing so with a political aim, trying to convince Faisal that cooperation with the Zionists could serve Arab interests as well. In other words, Sykes isn't articulating a personal belief in Jewish omnipotence, so much as weaponizing existing stereotypes in an effort to broker an alliance. That nuance, which dramatically shifts how we interpret the remark, is absent in Cooper's framing. And this wasn't a phenomenon confined to Sykes. We see a recurring pattern among British officials during this period, the tendency to project onto Jews an almost mythological level of global influence, an influence they often simultaneously feared and sought to harness. Chaim Weizmann, one of the biggest proponents of Zionism in Britain at the time, stated in his memoir Trial and Error that he acknowledged this dynamic. He stated essentially that there are no people in the world who have made so much of their enemies' prejudices as the Jews have done. That's not an admission of conspiracy. It's an acknowledgement of how Zionist diplomacy functioned within a world already steeped in anti-Semitic fantasy. The Zionists weren't inventing these ideas, they were navigating a political minefield in which those ideas already had deep roots. It's also worth noting that British policymakers weren't blank slates being manipulated by clever Zionists. They brought their own preconceptions to the table. David Lloyd George, Britain's Prime Minister at the time of the Balfour Declaration, later wrote that British leaders hoped Jewish support might sway the United States or revolutionary Russia in favor of the Allies. He said that Zionist leaders gave the British promises that if the British government declared for a national home in Palestine, that they would do what they could to rally Jewish sentiment and support throughout the world to the Allied cause. That sounds less like Zionist manipulation and more like mutual opportunism, standard stuff in wartime diplomacy. In addition, Cooper continues to criticize the Zionists, alleging that they, through Chaim Weizmann, sought to undermine the diplomatic negotiations between the Ottomans and the United States in 1917. This is framed in a way that implies the war in the East persisted because of, or largely due to, Zionist influence. However, the reality is that it was the British and French who were most vehemently opposed to any American peace negotiations with the Ottomans. Following the Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916, their primary focus was on carving up Ottoman territories in the Middle East. The last thing they wanted was a rapprochement before an inevitable capitulation. The British, under General Allenby, took Jerusalem in December 1917. Arab forces under the Sharif of Mecca and his son Faisal had meanwhile pushed north from the Hejaz into southern Jordan. But, to be clear, Hussein's forces never crossed the Jordan River, and their support for the British campaign in Palestine was peripheral at best. The conquest of Palestine was a British operation, full stop. And yet, Cooper claims, quote, at the exact same time the Balfour Declaration was being drafted and published, Arab soldiers were engaged against the Ottomans, liberating the Sinai and Palestine, and they were more than a little concerned that they had just been dying on the battlefields to conquer Palestine for a group of Jews who still lived in Europe, end quote. The British did utilize some auxiliary Arab units like the Egyptian Labor Corps in non-combat roles to support their advance into Palestine, but Hussein's troops remained firmly on the eastern side of the Jordan. While Faisal's forces were advancing north through the Arabian Peninsula, they were operating in a completely different area than the British in Palestine. In fact, not only were Hussein's forces not in Palestine, but Jewish forces were used by the British in a combat capacity. Jewish battalions, collectively known as the Jewish Legion, were formed under British command and numbered around 5,000 men. They fought actively on the front, most notably in the decisive Battle of Megiddo in September 1918. There's some evidence that a handful of Palestinian Arabs may have joined Faisal's forces to fight in Jordan, but there's no evidence that Hashemite troops participated in the campaign to liberate Palestine. So, if what Cooper is intending to say here is that Hashemite troops participated in the Palestine theater, he would be mistaken. Cooper then pivots to a claim that contradicts what he said earlier in this podcast. He says in relation to the Zionists, quote, what they want is a piece of the property the British had just promised to the people living in it, end quote. He's framing Hussein, a Hijazi leader from Western Arabia, as though he were some kind of local Palestinian figurehead. He wasn't. He had no organic connection to Palestine, and as we discussed when breaking down the McMahon-Hussein correspondence, his claim to the territory was tenuous at best. So even if you accept that Hussein had a claim, which is a big if, it's still a stretch to argue that the land was promised to the people living in it. If your position is that the McMahon-Hussein correspondence granted the Sharif of Mecca sovereignty over Palestine, then what you're really saying is that it was promised to a foreign Arab ruler with no direct connection to Palestine itself. To claim otherwise is to fall into the exact trap Cooper accuses the Zionists and European powers of creating, conflating a nascent Palestinian identity with a broader, undifferentiated mass of Arabs under Ottoman rule. The very broad brushstroke he criticizes elsewhere is the one he's now using. Episode 1 of Fear and Loathing in the New Jerusalem ends at the conclusion of the First World War. The world order, as we know it, is about to be shattered. The Ottoman Empire has been vanquished. So has Imperial Russia. The seeds of further conflict are being planted in Europe and the Middle East. While Cooper gets some things right, there's still plenty of room for improvement. We'll continue our critique of Fear and Loathing in the New Jerusalem next time, and we'll keep holding those making extraordinary claims accountable to the historical record. That brings us to the end of episode 1 of Crackpot History. I hope this episode has given you a flavor of what to expect in the future. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider sharing it with someone you think would appreciate hearing it. Thanks for tuning in. See you next time.